Ena whānau, ena iwi o Mapua, haere mai, and welcome here to another exciting evening entertainment at the Mapua Hall. My name is Jim Vors. I am standing up here as a spokesperson for this particular night, but as MC for the Mapua Action Group, which have put on this meeting. We have here tonight three important people from Nelson Tasman 2050, who are experts in terms of urban development. Hopefully we'll be able to provide you with some ideas and thoughts about the future of our town, and we'll also explain a bit about the relationship of the future development strategy to the Mapua Action Plan, which is what's involved in a lot of the rezoning of the territory. A point about this, and some people have said, are you anti-development? We are not anti-development. We're about logical, sensible, and well-informed development. That is what it is. It's not an emotive thing. This is logic. You may be familiar with the components of what has been put forward. So there's the Future Development Strategy, the FDS, which is a 30-year plan, and it covers the whole Tasman region. We then drop that back to the Mapua Action Plan, which also has a review, but that's more about the actual zoning of the land. So there's two components of this. You may be familiar with the zoning issues that were talked about very much the other day at the developers meeting. The FDS is coming up for voting by the councillors, and what we'll be looking at is some of the information that informs the FDS, because there's a huge amount of data that has gone into this work done by the council on the future development strategy. And if any of you even things like population prediction modelling is a fascinating area if you're really obsessive. I'll just, a quick little bit about the actual population data. This is the FDS population predictions, and you'll notice the little green bit up here this is where we are now. The actual census data goes back to 2014, but there's an estimate pretty accurate about 2017-18. And then that extrapolates out. The black line as being what the TDC is taking, and you'll notice that is actually beyond the maximum data set for the predicted population used by Stats NZ, and there's a whole lot of reasoning for why the TDC has taken that data as a higher level than what is actually being predicted by Stats New Zealand. But the important thing I want you to know, just to give you an idea of how some of the problems of those predictions, if you actually look at the date here, 2046, remember 2046. So, I'm a bit of an evidence-based nerd. I look up a lot of research papers, and I was quite interested in looking at the population prediction methodologies used by the TDC. They got Professor Nicola Jackson from Waikato University, and her unit did a whole lot of the prediction data. It's actually available on the TDC if you want to read it, but I won't bore you to tears with it. But essentially, when they look out to about 2043, they note that the population in Tasman is going to be dropping. Now, if we go back to that previous graph I showed you, TDC has got it going up. And this is just one of the problems you have with the data sets and dealing with some of these things. There's a whole lot of difficulties, a whole lot of inaccuracies, and it makes it really difficult for someone at the TDC. And honestly, I'd hate to be a councillor trying to deal with this. But you begin to get the idea, how much can you trust the data?
How?
What I wanted to remind you about is this is the particular bit of information that we have in front of us in the Future Development Strategy, and this is the Mapua data. By the next 10 years, we will have 620 more residents and require 320 new houses. Remember that number. This is what the TDC predicts we will have need in 10 years. So you would have seen this, those of you who were at the meeting the other week, and this is what the the District Association, Community Association put together, looking at the data from the proposed development on Stafford Drive, and then also factoring in the Mount Hope development. And basically it starts off, you've got 390 in this development. With Mount Hope, you're bouncing up to 500, approximately. These are rough figures. So we know that that figure of 500 is floating around. What's more interesting, if you actually go to the FDS, the earlier iteration of it, this is the land, this is Bill Lynch's land and some other people who live up in this area. This is this land, and they were talking about 500 houses going in there. Remember, we only need 320, but we've got 500 going in there, 119 in there. Now they've revised that and dropped that out. And 12 on the hill, that is in fact the Stafford Drive proposal. Only 12, because that says a rural zoning. But it begins to give you an idea. We're talking about figures that are substantially more than what is the predicted need. In fact, this works out, this particular one gives 631 new houses. Big figures. So what we did, we had a look at the existing zoning of land in Mapua. The existing zoning, without any changes to zoning, except for the deferred zoning areas would actually become available for housing given the services there. As for example, is the Seaton Valley Road section up here. That will very soon have its access to its services and just simply be able to develop without any rezoning of the land. So we're beginning to get an idea. So we've got the Stafford Drive Hill, we've got the Seaton Valley Road, we've got 44 up here, that's on the Mount Hope development. There's still 20 odd to be built in the floodplain. There's the 58 on the lower part of Higgs Road, and there's the 288 roughly that'll go in there. If you want to know how these figures would come from, if you take the acreages and then you use the formula that's obviously used by the TDC, particularly if I've taken a more conservative than what the TDC took for Bill Lynch's land, but you begin to come up with these figures. Now we do know, and everyone will tell me, that people down here are not likely to subdivide, they're not likely to sell. And I can understand that totally. I was in fact in that situation myself when I lived in Blenheim, and I was never going to shift. My wife and I were never going to shift, we were never going to go. We were going to stay there until she died. I didn't know she's died. I didn't know she's going to die, rather. I've been a doctor for 35 years and I still couldn't get it right. And if anyone can tell me that you can't be certain that these people there are not going to die at some point, honestly. So this is the existing zoning of land available in Mapua. 482 houses without any rezoning necessary, and then you've still got the 500 that they want to pop in up here. I think we've got plenty of possibility for housing. So most of those are greenfield developments, some of them aren't. But do we need land rezoned when we've got this already available? And anyway, why do we need greenfield development? Why not smarter urban design that reduces our carbon emissions, preserves the natural habitat in the wetlands, reduces urban sprawl onto prime agricultural land, and plans for the effects of sea rise and inundation? I'm not an expert on this, so we're going to have some come up. So I'd like to introduce you to the Nelson Tasman 2050 team. Timo Nilbela, Jan Heist, and William Samuels. Gentlemen, the table is yours. Just one thing at the end, we're actually videoing this. The video will be available on the web pages and on the Facebook pages. There's a little handout. Annette has got the handout out there, have we?
Will do.
Yep, so there'll be a handout at the door for you to pick up. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Excuse me. So on your map before you just showed all residential development or potential residential, but completely forgotten about was the commercial side of things. Where do you think we should do that?
I'm not talking about the commercial, this is not the issue. I appreciate what you're talking about. I'm not an expert on commercial. There are other people who are expert on commercial. I recognise what you're saying.
When you say smarter development, you should consider commercial.
There actually is data on the number of things that the TDC wanted. Look, in any case, we're going to have a question time after the gentlemen have done their presentation, so there'll be opportunity for that there, if you're happy then.
Yep.
Okay.
You
Scary. Have some tea.
All right, can everyone hear me? We're good? Okay, so, well, I'd just like to start introducing ourselves and getting some context of who we are. So we are Nelson Tasman 2050. We are a group of 4 built environment practitioners or professionals, and we formed relatively recently, and this is primarily instigated by the Future Development Strategy. We have some concerns with that as architects and urban designers and civil engineers, and so we wanted to have a way to better express our voice and better meet and discuss with council. So we formed this group, Nelson Tasman 2050, and we have been able to be involved in a lot more things in the Future Development Strategy, which has been great in terms of other policies and plan changes, and generally just in the future of our region, what that looks like. So it's been a really interesting process. We're still relatively new as a group, but doing some really interesting things and having some great conversations with people along the way. So we are here to have a talk about our thoughts on quality urban development, what that looks like. We haven't done any analysis of Mapua specifically, so a lot of these comments are probably going to be a little bit general in terms of Nelson Tasman, what the sort of region looks like, but there's obviously some content here. So Jan is from Mapua, so has a lot of knowledge of the issues currently facing Mapua. So we're here to really talk about what good quality urban development looks like, what the various planning processes are that Mapua is currently facing, what strategies are for growth and what that might look like for Mapua. And I think really the key here, and one of the fundamentals which would, as a takeaway, is what does a well-managed village growth look like? What does a village look like, such as Mapua, in 30 years' time and 50 years' time? You know, what is that vision? As obviously you're all here as people who are passionate about Mapua, what do you want to see in 30, 40, 50 years' time, and how do we get to that point? So to give an introduction, my name is William Samuels. I'm an architect. I'm based in Nelson, and my interest primarily is in residential, so in innovative modes of living and in housing. We have another architect, Magda. She is unable to be here today, but she is Director at Fine Line Architecture in Nelson. Jan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jan Heijs. I'm a local, and I'm a civil engineer. I've been involved all my life with in water management and infrastructure management. I worked with councils a lot, so I kind of think I know how they think.
Hi there, I'm Timo Neubauer. I'm an urban designer. I can't think of anything better to do on a Monday evening than coming out to Mapua and talking to a whole bunch of people I don't know. But yeah, look, I actually run a lodge out in Hope, but you know, I actually got back into urban design, kind of looking at what's going on in our district, and I feel like it's my civic duty to call things out that aren't going in the direction they should be going.
Right, so we have been active in a number of spheres. So the key one has been in engaging with councils in the form of submissions, and we've actually presented policies to council for hopefully them to take on board, and really just as an advocacy body for what better urban design and urban planning practices look like, how to get better housing options. We have been publishing articles locally and nationally. Some of you may have come across them. And events like this, where we're able to engage with the community, share our thoughts as design practitioners, and to hear from the community what it is that you're wanting out of your region. So we don't have any vested interest in this. This is, we're not getting paid by council or by developers or anything. We're just doing this. It's a non-profit, and we're just doing this because we have a vested interest, I guess, in we want to be living in the best region that we can be. So that's the extent of our interest, I suppose. And as mentioned at the introduction here, we're not anti-growth. We believe that there is areas where growth needs to occur, but it just needs to be done in the right way. And the time to plan for that growth is now, so that in 30 years' time we're no longer dealing with some of the same issues that we're dealing with at the moment. And as mentioned, we've not taken any in-depth analysis of Mapua, so this is reasonably high-level commentary at this stage.
Right. I didn't know Jim was already going to explain this, but I'm trying to do it a way better. So I think there's been a lot of confusion over the last couple of months about what was happening, what Tasman District Council was trying to do, and they had two things out for feedback. One was the future development strategy, and the other one was the plan change, and they're quite different. And I think it's important to understand what the differences are. So the future development strategy, it's about the whole of the region. You might have seen maps with also the yellow blobs. That's what they propose to be developed anytime in the future to cater for those growth needs. It's just a strategy, so it's not a right to develop yet. So if there's a yellow blob, everything still has to go through another process to make it available for development. So what do they use it for? Obviously they're going to use it for budgeting and for long-term plans, road services, but also indicate where plan changes might happen. Hence that plan change that was announced for Mapua a couple of months ago, because that came out of the previous FDS. The other issue with that, because it's a strategy, it falls under what we call the Local Government Act, they have to ask for feedback, but the council's free what they're going to actually listen, what they're going to do with the feedback. There's no specific process what and how they can basically accept or reject suggestions. And there's also no right of appeal or anything like that. So it's it's just a strategy that they're happy to listen to us, but that's all it requires. The current status is it's about to be approved. There's been deliberations. There's going to be a final joint meeting from Nelson and Tasman councils at the end of the month, and that basically settles it. Is there anything we can do? Yeah, we can lobby. People might choose to go legal, but that's pretty much an end of the road for the FDS. On the plan change, and the council initiated 3 areas for plan changes back in, when was that? February, March. That was based on the previous FDS. So a plan change is a legal document. It's got lots of details. It's got all the design rules. It's got how high and how wide and how big the areas can be. It's got maps, everything. The example is the Seaton Road development, although that particular plan change, the developer wants to initiate. They call it a developer or a part of plan change. It has all sorts of procedures in it. You have to justify it and re-justify it, look at environmental effects and all that sort of stuff, flooding, everything. The follow-up, the formal process is notifications, which were due in about now, then submissions, then there will be council hearings through a formal hearing panel. Can be council people, but probably more likely to be independent commissioners. Then you appeal, and you can go all the way to Environment Court. The Environment Court, very expensive. So my experience is that up to here, there's lots of people that submit. From here on, very few. Developers got deep pockets, we don't. So typically, this is where things end up in the Environment Court. The current status is it's on hold. So council has said, we'll stop this, we'll reconsider, and I'm still not officially sure what the reasons were, but I hope it's to allow for that structure planning process, which we will talk about later. The other thing is that the rejustification, why development, why now, and how much, is still based on that unofficial document. So we've seen in a number of plan changes in the area that although officially they have to re-justify, they say, oh, but it was already justified in the FDS, so we don't have to basically justify the need for growth because that's in the FDS. So it's a bit of a funny twist that the councils have been giving, specifically Nelson, in the recent times.
That's very clever.
Yeah, I guess that's me again. So the future development strategy. Well, it aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and consolidate growth and create well-functioning urban environments. Well, we've tried to do that for the last decades as urban designers. There have been some countries that had more appetite to take that up than others. I'd say New Zealand doesn't feature as an early uptaker on that. But now, this is actually the law. I don't know whether you're aware of that, but there have been, there's been the NPS, National Policy Statement on Urban Development. They basically asked for exactly that. It says how it's being done by consolidating urban development, compact cities, compact towns, reducing mobility. There's other statements out there. There's the government policy statement on transport that also calls for mode shift, active transport, not so much car use. So you've got the Zero Carbon Act. You can keep going. I think the legislation is pretty clear in New Zealand now. We have to pull finger and actually move, which we've failed to do for the last few decades. So I was really hoping for a bit more from this future development strategy. We feel that it's actually failing us. And it's failing us because of an over-reliance on greenfield development. Now, why is greenfield development a problem? I'd say in the context of Mapua, in particular, you look at what makes Mapua special. It's basically your location, where you are, what you've got around you. You've got productive land, you've got natural areas, natural land, you've got an awful lot of character around here, and all that pretty much gets lost through greenfield development because it just gets gobbled up and looks like anywhere else in New Zealand. It's also, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of what sort of transport or what sort of mobility is required to make things work. If you've got a low density, if you've basically got that, it's a picture of Richmond West, which doesn't look very different to any other suburban greenfield development. If you've got that, you have to use your car to get anywhere. You're too far to actually walk to a shop. There is no shop. The services are too far away.
There's a commercial centre in that development.
Yeah, there is, but it's actually a long way away.
The supermarket's just up the road.
Yeah. So let's get to that a little bit later. Generally, with your low density greenfield development, you've got the need for a lot of mobility. Yeah. And that mobility is becoming increasingly costly. So we're already noticing petrol prices are going up to $3 a litre now. Do we think they stop there? Probably not. So we kind of have to think about what do we do? How do we set our communities up for the future? Is it really like continuing on, making us dependent on petrol? Or should we allow ourselves some other options? And then, of course, there's greenhouse gas emissions. Every kilometre you travel by car, you have to burn fossil fuels at the moment. So that adds to your greenhouse gas emissions. So it's actually 90%, I think, was the last statistic I saw of your greenhouse gas emissions as an individual. So it's massive. And it's still growing in New Zealand. There's also some significant infrastructure cost concerned with low-density greenfield development because we've got a sprawling environment. We've got lots of houses to link into, lots of pipes in the ground. You can have that a lot cheaper if you consolidate growth and you've got, you know, one pipe serving 100 units rather than 2. Righto. Housing affordability, that's another big one. We've been grappling with that for a wee while. It seems like what we get out of these greenfield developments often is like 3-bedroom houses and upwards. They don't seem to be cheap, and we don't seem to get any better in our housing affordability on the basis of that. And that kind of goes hand in hand with diversity of housing options. It seems, you know, it's the standalone house, and that's basically it. That's your topologies. That's what you can buy. There's not many other options. If you want to downsize, there's not much for you to do. You kind of have to move somewhere else potentially. But the one that actually drives me up the wall the most is really the fact that as long as there's greenfield development available, it becomes very unattractive to intensify our urban areas, to do brownfield development. That's more complex, it's more difficult. And you know, if that's low-hanging fruit, if there's stuff that's easy, if I was a commercial developer, that's what I would do, if profit was all that mattered to me. So you can actually see that there is only very limited investment going into our existing urban areas, and it kind of adds to the decline of our towns. I mean, we don't have the picture in here now, but you just think about what Nelson looks like. You know, you've got, you know, car yards in the middle of town. You've got lots of car parks. That's not what a city looks like. That's vibrant. That you know, has a lot going for it. So I think we're heading into Mapua now. Mapua, I should say.
Right, well done. So in the future development strategy has 2 important reports in support. That's what all the needs for growth are based on. So there is the what they call Housing We Choose report, and there is the predictions done by TDC themselves. On the Housing We Choose, I think it's a bit of a funny statement because, of course, everyone wants a castle. So it probably should have been what we need, not what we want in an ideal world. But it does provide the basis for all the calculations. If you actually look in depth they did a big survey. They say a lot of key groups are underrepresented, like young families, people with lower incomes, Maori Pacifica communities, young families. So there's a lot of things that have been underrepresented in that study, but still they take the numbers that you see down the bottom basically as true. So 90% want to live smaller if they can. A lot of people want to live closer to shops and work. And 34% could not afford to buy a house. Now, if you take those under predictions as above, as I mentioned before, those numbers will be higher. But if you actually look at, for instance, 90% want smaller, the way they use it is they only use that on everything we've got and built from now. But they should actually use it on everything already, also the existing housing stock, but which they haven't done. Jim already talked about that. The way I looked at it without going into the numbers, it's just an extrapolation, a mathematical extrapolation of what happened in the past couple of years. There's no science behind it. I would argue that housing market has changed because the way we've grown, if you think about it, it's basically people escaping Auckland, Wellington, looking for a cheaper place. Well, we're not cheaper anymore. We were a couple of years ago, but not anymore. The housing market is now changing. So they kind of assume that the craziness of the last 5 years will extend for another 50 years with no change at all. And I think that's a dangerous assumption to make. And the whole consequence is that Mapua, if everything goes ahead as planned, will basically become a commuter suburb for Nelson and Murray. So the results, I'm not sure whether you've seen that, but I tried to kind of do a bit of an animation about how Mapua was looking, say a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, and what the whole footprint will be at the end when everything is realised. It's pretty rough, but it does give you a bit of a feeling how huge the change will be. Just to talk a little bit to it, I'm glad Jim already explained the numbers, but there's plenty of capacity in already zoned areas, certainly when you allow for better development in those areas. There is no logic for all the growth areas to be released at the same time. If you think about that plan change a couple of months ago, they wanted to have all those areas in black in the plan change. So when the plan change would be approved, say a couple of years from now, they would release the whole 50 capacity on day one. Things will change. Well, there's one certainty about planning, you got it wrong, always. So there's no flexibility in either dialing it up or dialing it down. So I think there's some really issues with going down the road that they have they've set out to do. And then obviously we know that sea level rise, and the latest prediction ends at sea level rise are actually even worse because of the land subsiding, so hasn't even been factored in all the planning yet. So,
All right, so I guess that's really the contextual background that we're looking at here. And I think that really there's a couple of really key questions, and probably these are questions that most of you have thought about already, but the first one is from a regional level. So from Nelson, Tasman, this is what the Future Development Strategy is. It's looking at a regional level. What does growth look like from Nelson and Tasman? And as Jan said, then Mapua is one of the core growth areas. And a question that we had, and this is part of our submission on the Future Development Strategy, is this the right location to cater for our housing growth? And that's from a regional level. So that's to say, if, as predicted by the Future Development Strategy, there's 25,000 new houses needed, which arguable, but let's say that that's the case. Where do we want those? Do we want those in areas where it's close to where we work, where we live, close to where we live, but close to where we work and close to where our kids go to school and so on? Or is Mapua really the right area to have all of that additional housing? And the next question is a local one, which is what should Mapua look like in 30 years' time? What is the future and how can it grow in a well-planned manner? I think the comments made earlier, which is that this is not necessarily, it's not an anti-growth thing, it's trying to make sure that growth is planned and it's considered, it's evidence-based, and it's going towards an aspirational vision, an outcome that as a community, that's what we're all pushing for. So that's the two questions, the regional one and the local one. So we have got some slides in here. What does well-managed village growth look like? Just a bit of context, when we have spoken with councils, it has been more on the question of quality intensification on our primary urban areas, so Nelson and Richmond, both of which are really suffering from a significant lack of housing in the inner cities, which is having some really adverse effects within those spaces. They're not the livable, vibrant communities that maybe they were 20, 30 years ago. And it also means that as a result of that, we're just seeing the additional sprawl. So we're coming from the point of view of that's something significant that Tasman District Council and Nelson City Council really need to focus on. But there's also the questions on areas such as Mapua. What does growth look like in Mapua? Which it's not being our focus primarily, but it is definitely a good question to be asking. So we have got a few points here, so this was mentioned at the beginning, but the question of protecting and enhancing the natural environment and the landscape character and the productive land. So why is it that people choose to live in somewhere like Mapua? And that question is really fundamental, and because that tells you what needs to be protected. The next one is quite critical when you're looking at well-planned growth, which is employment opportunities. So, irrespective of how many houses are built in Mapua, those people do need to work somewhere. And with the extent of construction work proposed, also housing proposed in the area, that essentially means that Mapua could become a commuter suburb for Richmond and Nelson and Motueka, where people just sleep here and then they drive off to the other towns and cities. A diverse mix of housing typologies and also housing affordability. For somewhere like Mapua, having residents living within walking distance of the village centre is really fundamental, and I think that it drives where houses should be built. Otherwise, everyone just has to drive in to the inner city, which means all of a sudden you have car parks everywhere, rather than people walking by and making those community connections. This is something that we quite strongly feel, so particularly for our major urban areas, is quality intensification over greenfield development, which means building up rather than building out. So, denser areas within the centre of our towns and cities. And then investment in public spaces and revitalising of these existing village areas. And that can come from things such as some intensification in the inner part of the village, where if there's some additional units put into the centre, then that can feed on into upgrades to public spaces and areas within the village. So in terms of the natural environment, obviously I've touched on this, the identifying and conserving those local qualities that make the village unique. Regenerate the coastal and wetland areas, which is obviously a big question with the proposed development. And then support primary industry and local producers. It's, as we see out in Richmond, those are some of the most highly productive lands in the country that are now turning into housing. And then a community focus to any growth. So this is local employment opportunities so that people don't have to leave the village to go and work and to drop their kids off to school. Having the community at the heart of any development. Housing choices, so it's not just catering to nuclear family, that there's options for older people, for single people, maybe for people who want to live together as a group. That needs to be available. Otherwise you get, you're unable to cater for a diverse mix of people. Similarly, co-housing and other community-led housing initiatives are very evidence-based reasons or ways to create more lively and communities. And then investment in public amenity. This is the spaces that everyone uses together. The better those spaces are, the better it is for the community. Building up, not out. And so I think there is a caveat here that when we're talking about this is not talking about big high-rises in Mapua, but this is just talking about instead of having single bedroom or single dwellings which are on large amounts of space in the centre of the town, there are different ways to do that, such as mixed use. So this one here at the top, this has some housing on top, and then underneath that's some retail spaces, so shops and so on. It's a better way to get people into those spaces and use their land more efficiently. And it's much better for those people living there because they don't have to drive a car to get to the centre of the village. It's just right at their front door. It's more efficient in terms of the spatial use, obviously reducing that sprawl, and reduces our greenhouse gas emissions because you're not driving everywhere. Critical list at the bottom is reduced infrastructure costs, which Timo mentioned as well. There are some estimates in the future development strategy about the cost of the infrastructure surrounding the 25,000 new houses over the next 30 years, and it's yeah, it's substantial, and it doesn't get into the maintenance costs associated with that. So if we can consolidate some of those things, then that should result in lower rates in the long run. A walkable village, there is a principle often used in urban design, which is around the 800 metres of, people tend to walk 800 metres. If it's longer than that, people don't walk, they drive. For somewhere like a smaller village, that distance might actually be shorter than that. But it's something to keep in mind that when we're talking about where housing is going, just to keep that distance, how far will people walk to get into the centre? Housing growth should be integrated with new work and leisure opportunities to make sure that we're having the right mix of functions within the village. And then streets designed for people rather than cars. So at the core of this is a really big question. I think this is a question for yourselves as the community group, is what do we want Mapua to look like in 30 years' time? And this is about creating really proactive vision. It's not a case of just letting council dictate what the village will look like. It's about coming up with a vision and then pushing for that vision to make that happen. This is one strategy that we would suggest is worthwhile exploring, which is the idea of master planning and spatial planning. I've put this on here. This is not representative of in any way of Mapua. This is much bigger, but this is just an example of a master plan that was done for a town, and this was looking at how do we cater for housing, but how do we also cater for commercial interests, how do we cater for recreational interests, for school, for education, and how do we do that in a manner which is well considered and designed and means that once it's all there, it's going to be a really great space for all of us. So this is images from that same master plan. These are 3D visualizations of what that might look like. And I guess the point with this is it's about creating an aspirational vision. It's about creating something that as a community you can really grasp and say, this is what we are aiming towards. And that then guides decisions. It guides policy decisions, it guides how you as a community can support and encourage particular types of development. It can let you know what land might need to be earmarked for potential commercial opportunities in the future or housing and so on. But without a vision or without this longer term master plan, it's quite difficult to really guide growth in a direction that you want. So what can the community do to promote a better future for Mapua? One of you guys want to speak to this? Surprise.
Yep. So you can think about potential actions. Of course, talking to your councillors, demand better outcomes from your council. Putting together submissions, explaining your position. We've done the future development strategy. Well, now the plan changes, and I understand the NDCA and council are going to talk about sometimes called the structure plan, sometimes called the spatial plan, but that's the future of Mapua in a spatial way, as William just explained. And I think it's really important that we actually focus on this and have constructive input into that process. And yeah, that's really what we would suggest to do. And obviously, either individual or as a group, Assessment 2050 would be happy to provide some help with it. And now we've got an MC that is going to control you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. That is very informative. We'll have an opportunity for some questions. I'd like to make sure that you actually have good questions to ask. Preferably don't grandstand. If you've got questions that these gentlemen can answer, please fire away. Annette, would you like to grab a mic? And we'll have the other mic too. So you must have all been sitting here thinking about the dream of this future for our glorious town. You're all happy with that? Could you identify who you are, please, so that we may all know too? Thanks very much.
Bruce Struthers. Appreciate this.
Can you hold it up to the...
Sure. I appreciate your presentation. What I don't see any consideration for, and I'm not saying it's an omission, is where does the viability of mass transit sit in any of this? Thing one. Thing two is what incentives are there for council members to do anything but the way they are doing it, which is more homes mean more ratepayers. Unaffordable housing means more rates or more rate revenue from those houses. So what can we do to break the model where the council is paid to do what they're doing? Especially since they have a big mortgage to pay in the form of the dam.
Right, okay. So your first question was about public transport. Public transport is great. Yeah, big fan of it. Comes right after active transport. Active transport is ideal. Mapua is a fair distance away from a lot of services, employment, and I'm not sure whether we made this point clear enough in our presentation, but that is one of the main issues that we have with Mapua as a major growth node. So we do agree with the notion that while it's easy to sell a house in Mapua, it might not be the best place for us as a whole, as a community, as a region, to place everybody with their house, because they need to go somewhere and work somewhere, and whether we really get them all to sit on a bus to drive all the way into Nelson, I'm not sure, is the honest answer. I'm doubtful. But my approach would be a different one. My approach would be remove the need for this mobility in the first place. Get people to live closer to where they work, closer to the services that they use, the schools and hospitals, God knows what everybody needs in their daily life. So that actually cuts a lot of mobility out, which is a major source of our greenhouse gas emissions. It's actually a major source of us idling and not being productive because we're just sitting in a car in a traffic jam. So that would be my answer to this question. I know that there are some plans apparently to bring in a bus that will be the magic solution to all our transport woes, but whether it's going to be taken up as well as some people hope, I don't know. Your second question was about rates and the council incentive of just getting more and more and more and more growth, more people, more ratepayers, more residents. That is a major issue in my view. I mean, I'm not an absolute expert on any of this, but I think we are grappling with the issue of short-term thinking rather than long-term thinking here. And we're in a 3-year election cycle, so you want to be seen as getting something done while you're there at the council table. So you're not actually thinking about the next 30, 50, maybe even 100 years. You're actually thinking about the next 3 years. So that is a major issue really, because when we're talking about the infrastructure cost of building these greenfield developments, a lot of that infrastructure is often paid by developers straight away. Well, actually developers don't pay it, they basically just hand it through and put it on the sale price of the property. But the council doesn't have to pay it out of their pocket, so for the council it actually looks really attractive. And that's what we see in the discussions around the council table all the time. That's what we see as the advice from officers to councillors. No, greenfield is super easy, nice, we don't have to pay anything. It's great, much cheaper. What is lost in this discussion is the actual operational expenditure, because once this is built, it actually passes into council ownership. So council is then responsible for keeping it up, replacing it actually after 30 years. And I mean, you just look at, councils all over the show, they're all struggling with it. So building more of that, yeah, short term, fantastic. Long term, it's a disaster. Sorry, did I miss a part of your question, or was there another part to it?
Thanks. Other questions? Yes. Any?
Thank you, Tracy Dawson. First of all, I'd like to thank you for giving us possibilities, opening our eyes up to what Mapua could be like. It's exciting. So we have to look at the truth behind everything. If we move forward knowing the real facts, we can then create a compelling argument for a vision that suits us. I don't want to live in a community that's all the same people. Boring. I looked through the playground the other day. There were older people playing tennis, young people playing football. Everyone's accepted here in Mapua. We're a very special community. I guess I'm nervous. But I think for me, I didn't know how we can have a voice. So I think we need your expertise to help gather our voices, to enable us to put compelling arguments to the council and find a better way forward, like you're suggesting. That was great, having those houses with new funky shops underneath, with artists, creating a lively, vibrant place.
Have you got a question for the gentleman?
Excuse me?
Please, if you could get to that, that'd be
Thank
nice.
you.
Thanks.
You're sounding like the council.
I'm good at it.
How do we best move forward? We're all going to have different views. We haven't got a lot of time, so that's what I'd like to know. How do you propose that we move forward in a way that's actually going to meet a vision?
Well, as I said before, there is obviously making submissions is one thing. I'm not sure whether they go anywhere sometimes. So I think it's putting pressure on the politicians, on the people you choose, certainly coming elections. Listen carefully what they stand for. But then I think we are now presented with an awesome opportunity of that spatial plan. So I think we need the community behind developing that spatial plan in the way we want it to look like. But also, and it's a bit hearsay because I'm not living here for that long, but there was, once upon a time, there was a spatial plan in Mapua. And that's gathering dust and nothing has been achieved because for some reason council could not force the developers or did not commit to the outcomes that were agreed at the time. So what I have been suggesting to the FDCA is to have clear agreement with the council to make what we call terms of reference, have a good terms of reference that what the process is to develop the plan, but also what the process is actually committing and delivering on the plan. So there needs to be some really good agreement, otherwise it's a waste of time. But I think those are the two pathways we need to walk. And in addition to that, basically expecting councils to keep those plan changes on hold until we've sorted that. Because that can have a huge impact in whatever happens next, including potential new developments. You got anything else?
Just a question, do we have any of the councillors here? Over the back, so would the councillors like to stand up and just introduce themselves, please? Annette, can you pass the mic to the councillors just for a second? Thank you very much.
Kia ora. Thank you for the invite. My name is Councillor Walker and I'm a Mapua councillor.
Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. Most of you will know me. I'm David Ogilvie, another Mapua councillor, and usually a regular attendee at the Mapua meeting. So I know Timo, I know Jan, and thank you. And look, it's a great presentation. I would like to start and make a few arguable points, but now is not the time to do that. So look, the strength limitation and all the best. But I should say one thing. How much detail do you really want the council to provide in a plan change? Normally we decide the width of the street, number of footpaths, and that sort of thing, size of sections, and a variety. How much detail beyond that do you really want in a plan change? Now, it's up to you. If you want, say, water tanks instead of rainwater, if you want number of trees on your parks, then we can look at those details. But at present, the amount of detail in any plan for plan change is reasonably detailed. If you want more, that's your choice. And look, council will look at those. We're not negative towards that at all. We'd like to see more detail if that's what the community is asking for. And I say it quite in a friendly way, in an acceptable way. You know, we are listening, and hopefully we can work in with the Mapua community for what you want in terms of your new town.
Thanks, David. From the MDCA, Marion, here's Paul here. So Marion and Paul are from the Mapua District Community Association, and they'll be having more meetings held about this very topic in the near future. So keep an eye on the Mapua District Community Association website and Facebook pages. There's a question over here, please.
Thank you. Can I answer?
Yeah, sorry, far away. So we need to have that first for David's questions.
Sorry, I do like to answer that question, David. The level of detail is obviously something for later, but I've been through a few court processes. The more detail, the better, what I would say, because whatever you don't hardwire is up for grabs. And so, if you say, oh, we just want, the current residential requirements are minimum 450 square metre lots, and the developer knows the market, he knows what to provide. Well, that hasn't worked in the past. So I would suggest that a new plan change, if there's ever anyone, it needs to spell out we need so many of this size, so many of this size, we need so much social housing, you need to spell it out. Also, in terms of I suppose the community, do you want streets for cars or do you want streets for people? So there's a lot of detail you can bring into that. And the more you leave to a consent process, the less likely you achieve your outcomes as a community.
Thanks very much. Over here.
My name is Lynn Smith. Thank you all for the presentation. That was fabulous. My question is a big picture question that in terms of considering our future strategy vision for this community, I feel very ill-equipped to be able to contribute to that without the fundamental overriding factual basis on which to plan along. So my question is, how do you make accountable our local council to the overriding future development strategy in law by our government that actual planning must meet this criteria? Because at the moment it seems like lovely words, but nobody's really accountable. So how does that happen? I'm more interested in that before we go anywhere else.
Well, it's a hard one. I guess in legal terms, there's not much. Vote and require councillors, and they can require staff to listen and to have what I would like to say, but I think William's probably more experienced in that than I am, a community-led process, which in the end will provide something that we actually aspire to.
I'll just briefly speak to something that we met with Nelson City Council last week to pitch an idea, which is something that happens overseas. This is probably a lot more of a general comment, but we have some concerns that development locally, well, I guess the approach of council is often quite passive. In that, and it's actually quite explicitly stated in Nelson City Council's Intensification Action Plan that the role of council is not to provide housing, it's not to provide development, it's merely to create an enabling environment for development to occur. Basically what that means is that the actual development is just left to the private market, it's left to developers. We argue though that that is not getting us the outcomes that we need, and that when it's entirely left to the commercial market, that's what happened. We get this sprawl which is currently happening outside of Richmond, that this greenfield land is being taken up. We're not getting the diversity of housing that we need. We're not getting affordable housing, because why does a commercial developer want to provide affordable housing? It doesn't really fit their model. There's also the lack of incentive for commercial developers to think about shared spaces, about how buildings contribute to the community, about how that engagement with the streetscape. So we have suggested the idea of an urban development agency to Nelson City Council. The idea with that is it's an entity which is at arm's length of council, but its role is to develop some of those master planning strategies and to be actively engaging with the development process by partnering with private developers, by partnering with iwi, by partnering with housing cooperatives to get some of those really good quality design outcomes, or urban planning outcomes. That's basically a way of saying that it's quite hard to answer your question in the current conditions, because it is difficult to try and enforce some of those planning laws. But we feel that there are ways to do that, and if we are thinking about how we're providing housing and how we're doing urban planning in the future, then I think we actually need to really rethink some of these basic principles about how we're doing that.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Good evening, Gary Clark. Just a couple of things. Firstly, I think Council's looking at a...
Gary, could you hold it closer, please? The people at the back having trouble hearing.
Yeah, sorry. There's a Council currently looking at how to deal with the Mapua urban growth aspect, and that's been obviously a consequence of the senior land development and what they're proposing there. It's quite interesting when you look at that development and compare what can actually happen as of right in the areas that are already zoned residential. What you're seeing is typically a structured plan provided for that development. The other land that you've highlighted on there has no structured plan. They can put in houses and have no green space, no cycleways apart from what's required under the council standards. And I see this opportunity where council's looking at that structured plan for Mapua, an opportunity to actually have good outcomes for that residential land that has already the right to build any way they like, without any consultation or anything. And that's a good thing that's come out of that senior proposal, if you like, is you're actually seeing intensification, you're seeing green space, you're seeing walkways, cycleways, and a village type thing that wasn't dissimilar to what you showed on that wall. But I encourage people in this room to actually get involved in that process, because there's the opportunity to protect some of that land that sits on the hill and actually provide some green space, and not end up with what you had up in Mapua Rise, with just houses right against Mapua Drive on that right-hand side as you come down. Sorry, that was a bit of grandstanding. There's no question. It's just a thing. Get involved in the process.
Yeah, you're deeply involved in it, I agree. Yeah. Other questions?
If I could just quickly respond to that, obviously no question there, but take the opportunity to grandstand as well. It's what our approach is as a group, and the way that we're really trying to approach questions about urban development and housing is to try and do this as proactively as possible, and that's from a solutions-driven approach. It's very easy to sort of put your hands up sometimes and say, we shouldn't be doing this. This is terrible. The question is really how do we get the good outcomes, and how do we propose those solutions? So as you referred to there, sometimes when some of these proposed plan changes come up, that can actually be a really good opportunity for a community to come together and say, well, hold up a sec. Is this the direction we're going in? How can we make this better? And I think the fact that there are so many people in this room here really says that there's actually a lot of community engagement, and there's a lot of active participation, and there could be some really good outcomes of this process. So I think it's about trying to direct that energy into some solutions, into some really positive, proactive outcomes.
Well, thank you, everybody. Oh, sorry, another question over the back there, Annette.
I've got a big booming voice, I'm sure I can get through. I'm just sitting here and thinking the crossroads that Mapua is at the moment, and it's a very exciting time to be part of it. But I'm wondering, from your research that you've done, how did these model alternatives come about? Was it that the communities were able to attract a different type of developer? Or, you know, what enabled it to happen? I mean, my sort of lateral thinking is, wouldn't it be wonderful if TDC said, let's use Mapua as an experiment. Let's just, you know, they keep nagging at us and they want things differently. Why don't we just let something different happen in the Mapua community? But I'm not quite sure what the components are that need to happen for that to take place.
I'm sure if the TDC's got the same idea of an experiment that you and the rest of us do. I probably think they're doing a great job already.
I think that the same answer applies again. I think being part of that structure planning process would be the way to go, and really out of the box thinking. Also, I think it's been mentioned before, but I think it's important that we realise that in the existing already zoned residential area, there's already capacity, as Jim already pointed out. But about a year ago, I did a presentation to the MDCA and later to the committee in Desmond. I said, why don't you put a priority to think about appropriate zoning of the already zoned area? Just do a plan change on that, because at the moment the residential rules apply, which do not required to provide for high housing diversity, for instance. So I suggested that priority should be given actually in rezoning everything that's already zoned, specifically those ones that are yet to be developed. You could equally think about it in the existing urban area and trying to get a bit more diversity of housing in there. That should be a priority, and that should be based on whatever the spatial plan is going to tell us.
Yeah, I think you're facing issues on a number of levels here. The biggest one I see at the moment for Mapua is the amount of growth that you landed with. So I'm highly doubtful of that being a very good thing for the community. You know, for Mapua itself, I'm not sure. For the whole Nelson Tasman region, I would say it's certainly not a good thing. So that would be the first thing I would be attacking and asking the question whether that is really how it's got to be. Because if those numbers are set in stone and Mapua has to absorb that sort of growth, then your options are very limited. The second one is, if we can, as a whole region come to an agreement that Mapua needs some growth, but maybe not quite that level, but some growth to kind of rejig what it is a little bit, to make it even better than it already is. Provide more diversity, for instance, in terms of housing choices, those sort of things. That you still need a little bit of economic driver for that. So you need some growth. So if we can get to that level, you can then look at how can we change our planning rules? So incremental growth actually works in our favour. It works a bit more to achieve what we really want out of this. That's possible. But what I would suggest is to actually think a little bit more proactively. So rather than just leaving it all to whoever wants to do something, does something, and then something comes out of it, and that's our town. Think about what you want your town to look like first. And then think about what planning rules you need to achieve that. And we've made a few suggestions for Nelson that are currently being worked through for medium density areas, for instance, to turn that into a better, more sustainable model. I don't see why that shouldn't be possible in Mapua as well. And then, of course, the idea that William has flagged is something, I don't see why that shouldn't stand for Mapua as well. I mean, why shouldn't you have your own development agency that looks at how you can make this all happen?
Rebecca, you've got a question?
It's really
Could you stand up and introduce yourself, please? Oh, you can't, sorry, apologies.
I have a hip problem. I'm one of the organisers for this meeting, and I really appreciate your time. I thought it was great, your presentation. And I think that the questions that people are asking about what next, what can we do about this, I think those are really important. And certainly putting submissions into the council, I think, is a worthwhile process. You know, it is. You've got to do it. But I think that there are other things that we can do, and organising is one thing we can do. And I think that we've started the process. We've got the Mapua Action Group, and we'll have a live website soon. And I think that, you know, having conversations with the council, I think, is a really valuable thing. And if we can organise around that, maybe even, I don't know, maybe even do some fundraising for getting an urban planner to do a master plan for us, or something like that. It's a possibility, perhaps. But getting some conversations going would be a great thing. Again, I want to thank you really a lot for coming out tonight, Monday night, with your families and all. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Can I just make an observation on one of the points you made there about speaking to councillors? And I think over the last couple of months we have been very active in meeting with councillors in both Tasman District Council and Nelson District Council. And it can't be overstated how privileged we are to be in a region where you can do that so easily that, you know, if you just email a councillor and meet them for a coffee the next day, you know, I've not yet had any councillor say no to that. You know, and it's not like in Auckland where, you know, frankly, that's not going to happen. We're in a community that most of us know our councillors, and they're engaged, and you know, it's worthwhile having those conversations, because I think submissions are extremely worthwhile, because often you can go through a lot of technical detail and create some really strong arguments, but having a conversation with council is really just a good way to put a face to the concerns that you have.
I'll take one last question because we're getting towards the end of our time limit. Brennan?
Brennan Lipka from the Community Association. I know this is all about people. I mean, we are people. But I remember reading a story to my son about the lorax and about the trees. And let's represent the trees. Let's represent nature. And I think that's a really important part for this area. You look around and there isn't much of nature left. It's either farms, it's houses, and wouldn't it be fantastic if some of the land that is sold is returned back to nature, so we can build an environment that is much more inclusive.
Thanks very much. We'll wait one last question. Sorry, Derek.
Derek Paul.
Let's turn it off.
I'm concerned.
The mic's off. I'm sorry. Did you turn off your...
Is that better?
You got it?
Yep.
Does that work? Okay.
Yep.
Derek Paul. My concern is that, worthy as all these initiatives may be, we may be a little late. At a meeting with the developers, it was told that, for instance, Seniors Farm would be settled on the 19th of June. I don't know whether that's happened or not, but if it has, the train has already left the station.
No, but don't forget there's the spatial plan. There's got to be all that work that they were talking about with the spatial plan. And NDCA, Paul, you could comment on that.
Paul McIntosh, I'm the chair of the Community Association. So to your point about the land, yes, that was the closing date. It's a private deal, so I'm not aware of whether it went through, but I've got no reason to expect it didn't. But that does not mean that the concept, the housing concept that was discussed tonight, can actually proceed, because the vast majority of the land on which that concept is being built is still zoned Rural 1. So the plan change that was discussed tonight is required to go through in order for that development to proceed. The 12 houses that you showed up on the hill, that's currently Rural 1 deferred rural residential. So that is the only area that, and the only number of houses that the developer can currently build on that total senior land without any changes going through. So it is, I agree that it's late in the process, but I'm very encouraged by the number of people here tonight and the amount of interest in this. It's not too late. Submissions work, talking to your councillors work, getting engaged as a community works. And to Jan's point about the spatial plan, the structure plan, we're very early in the process there. We've count our wins. We've stopped the plan change. We have managed to get a commitment in both emails, not in terms of reference yet, Jan, but a commitment from the council to proceed with the update, the plan update with the structure plan. And they have engaged a consultant internally to get all of the interested people within the council together to gather all their thoughts. The next step is to actually get representatives from the community to participate in the review of the initial draft of that plan, and then it'll go through a process which could be, at this stage, 6 months plus. So it's definitely going to be after the next elections, and it's going to be probably with Christmas, New Year, sometime in February, March next year before all this gets finalised. So there is still plenty of time for everybody in this room to have an impact on the outcomes in the area. So please continue to engage with any group that's willing to put our community's interests first and work proactively towards that. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all very much for coming here tonight. It's been good to have some of the korero that has gone on. I'd like to thank our 3 visitors. Gentlemen, your services and your information has been valuable. There is a little pamphlet at the desk on the way out which provides some of the further websites, Facebook and other methods of further engaging on this. I wish you all the best for your travels home. Thank you very much. Ka kite anō.
National Policy Statement Urban Development that talks about good functioning, well-functioning urban environments and meeting climate change, blah blah. There's some fundamental requirements